Welcome to this timely webinar on the housing affordability crisis. I'm very glad you can join me. I think this event will be extremely valuable. In this webinar, we're going to have an open, interactive discussion on some very current events. Now, let me share with you one very timely headline. According to MLC, the National Australia Bank's wealth management partner, and reported in The Guardian, almost 2/3 of Australians believe the next generation will never be able to afford their own home and will not enjoy the same standard of living as their own. It's concerning to me to see so many people are worried about how their children, with the constant rise in property prices, will afford their own homes and be able to live a comfortable lifestyle. And according to this report, those worries also spread to half of those surveyed who believe they won't be able to maintain their own lifestyle in 10 years' time. So, is it time to look at the situation in a fresh way? Let me throw this out to you. Is home ownership really even necessary? A lot is happening in the property investment market at the moment, so I've brought together some very special guests to provide some expert commentary. Hans Cunnan, the Chief Economist at St George Bank, ELIZA OWEN, Expert Market Analyst and Economist from Residex, and the Australian Senior Research Analyst of CoreLogic RP Data, Cameron KUSHER. Together we're going to present some important consideration and ideas for you. Plus, we'll open the lines to answer your questions in my Ask Jane segment. And I also have some dates to give you for my upcoming suburb hotspotting workshops. And to help me man the phones tonight is John Hubbard, who I work closely with here at Your Property Success. Hi, John.
Hey, Jane. How's things?
Before we get started, can you quickly go through the housekeeping for us?
Yeah, sure. If you're on a computer and you're experiencing problems hearing, or perhaps we can't hear you during the questions, there is the option to call in on your telephone. The telephone number can be found in the sidebar menu under the audio options drop-down menu. You can call that number from a landline or a mobile phone or from a Skype account. So when you have a question for Jane, all you need to do is raise your hand by pressing the little hand icon, which is in the sidebar menu of GoToWebinar. It's quite small and hard to see, but it is there. And by clicking the hand button, you will notify us that you have a question. And when it's your turn, I will unmute your line. When I do unmute your line to take your question, you will get an automatic message saying your line has been unmuted. And so then you'll know you're on. You can also ask questions by writing your questions into the question box at the bottom of the control panel, and we will try and get to those written questions in the time that we have available. But there is a lot of people here tonight, and we really do give priority to the spoken questions. Remember, there's never such a thing as a silly question. We're all here to learn tonight, so I encourage you to make the most of the opportunity to speak to Jane and make the effort to engage in the process as much as possible. And as you know, we here at Your Property Success love to spread the word about low-risk, no-nonsense property investment. And so often these calls contain some really great content and questions that would be extremely helpful to other people too. So we routinely record these calls and reserve the right to share the content down the track. So participating in this call, you are acknowledging this, and if for some reason you prefer not to be included on a recording, we just ask that you contact our office on 1300 963646 within 24 hours, and we can edit you out. Back to you, Jane.
So, with that out of the way, let's get into it. With a growing population projected to top 36 million by 2050 and one of the most expensive property markets in the world, is Australia in the midst of a housing affordability crisis? Latest information from CoreLogic RP Data shows Australian capital city house prices are marching higher yet again after a pullback in the latter part of last year. Currently, Sydney's median house prices are over $1 million, something that was unthinkable even a couple of years ago. With prices still rising, many would-be first-time buyers are priced out of the market, stimulating growth in the rental market and fueling concerns about international investment, tax concessions and bank lending. Over the last 20 years, there's been significant growth in the rental market, with 1 in 4 households now renting. Now listen to this statistic. According to the last CoreLogic RP Data Pain and Gain report, 31.2% of people who sold their property in the last quarter sold it for double what they bought it for. There is no doubt that residential property has been a wealth generator for many Australians in the past. Is it going to stay that way in the future? Now, I have some ideas on this, but I'll hold that thought for a moment because I have a twist I think you may be interested in. However, first, I want to get to our expert guests. Now, we'll be opening the lines for your questions very shortly. But first, let me introduce you to our first guest this evening. I have Hans Cunnan, Chief Economist of St George Bank with me. Now, I recently met Hans and I saw a presentation from him. Now, he's also an author of Borrow and Build, and he has many accolades under his belt. But one of the things that really struck me was Hans actually pulled together some positives and negatives of the economy and where we are in Australia at the moment. And I think as a great overview, it's wonderful to have Hans with us to give us some insight. So welcome, Hans.
Thank you.
So
there's a lot going on.
There is a lot going on, and what I loved about the presentation I saw you give the other day was that, you know, if you look at the economy as a whole, there are some positives and some negatives. So I'd love to hear from you about, you know, where you see us at the moment.
The world continues to grow. The United States has recovered from the GFC. It's not powering ahead, but at least it's thinking about putting up interest rates. That tells me that the US economy is going okay. China, there's always sort of a lot of bad news stories about it, but they are lifting people out of poverty into middle classes. The middle class is rising in China. That will be a driver of growth for decades to come, and there are a lot of opportunities that flow from that. So the world isn't about to head into a global recession or another GFC. That's a positive.
That's a good news story.
Absolutely. Another good news story in Australia is that our population continues to rise, generates a lot of activity. And in Sydney, we're seeing that particularly with the housing boom. You know, it's not just for Sydney-siders, it's for all the people who come to New South Wales. And a rising population is a good thing. And something that's kept us all going has been low interest rates. And that's not going to change in the short term. We had the Reserve Bank meet recently, left rates on hold. We actually think they're going to leave rates on hold for the rest of this year. And that just takes pressure off people who do have debt. Now, a lot of people are now well ahead on their mortgages, and they're not quite as stressed as they were 7 or 8 years ago when the GFC was in full swing. So, you know, there's some of the positives. Do you want some more?
Yeah, please do. I like positives. Everyone else is talking doom and gloom, Hans.
Yeah, well, look, the Australian dollar, when it was $1.10 against the US, it was great if you're going overseas, but it was really tough if you were a producer in Australia. We were less competitive. Currency's now down around 75, 76, and that really does help a lot of industries in Australia, tourism in particular, agriculture, international education. It helps the manufacturing sector. It cushions against the fall in iron ore prices. The lower currency is good for Australia. Yep, it's gone up from 70 a few weeks ago to 75, but compared to $1.10, it is still really good. And you can see the trends in the number of visitors coming to Australia. How a weaker dollar does help, and we don't think it's going to go away. You've only got to look outside to see the amount of infrastructure spending that's happening. I mean, there are cranes everywhere. We're digging holes, we're building airports, we're digging tunnels. That creates a lot of jobs. And people with jobs spend money, and that helps keep the economy ticking over.
So the good news story is populations is going up. More people in Australia are going to be buying more things. There's going to be more money in the economy. Interest rates are down. Weak Australian dollar is going to push up the economy as well. So thumbs up till the end of the year, pretty much.
Indeed, and wait, there's more.
Yes.
Not just steak knives, but, just as a final thing, the Premier of New South Wales, Mike Baird, is, stamp duties have just gone through the roof, the collections of them, and that gives him money to spend. And we are spending it, and that's part of what is driving a lot of this infrastructure spending. There's just a lot of good things going on, and it's too easy to get caught in the doom and gloom.
And one of the things a lot of people, point to the fact that, we are a multi-market in Australia, and we can't just make, decisions based on housing booms in Sydney and Melbourne. But what the good news is, and I guess that I see in my business, is although people may have properties in Sydney and Melbourne that have gone up significantly in value, they're not necessarily buying there. So they're buying in Brisbane and Adelaide and out of the state. So they're actually generating a lot of that growth interstate as well.
They are. They are. That's just one of the benefits that you can get from having a diverse economy. Life is different in Queensland and Brisbane and Canberra. Canberra is seeing overflow from Sydney markets. It's a good place. It's a reasonable place to invest. Their population is growing. It's even regional centres are growing as people move in from the country and retire in the regional centres. Some of the regional centres are doing quite well as well.
I guess it kind of leads me to one of the topics that we've been discussing as well, which is about the house affordability issues. And I imagine, did you have kids?
I have 3, and they're all in their 20s.
Okay, so you're probably thinking about this. Well, the MLC report came out that said 2/3 of people who were surveyed didn't believe that their kids could afford a home. Is this a big concern that's on your mind?
Oh, well, absolutely. Personally and professionally, and from a societal perspective, you wonder where people on average wages can now afford to live. Where do the AMBOs and the teachers and the policemen and the people who clean the offices, the tradies, where do they live? And it's getting further and further out. Hence the need for more infrastructure. It's a social issue, and one of the things is sort of the NIMBY issue. Nobody wants anything in their backyard.
Not in my backyard, yeah, right.
Absolutely. So, people need to live closer to the city. We're going to have more infill.
Yep.
Infill, medium density, and people buck up. It'll affect our suburb, and we don't like it. Well, we might have to put up with it because. Sorry, go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say we've seen some innovative government decisions like the granny flat legislation, or that you've got in New South Wales, and states seem to be taking that on as well. So we're going to have to get a bit more innovative as well, as you say, about having people live closer to where they need to work or have better infrastructure to get them in sooner.
And one of the good things I think is the rezoning of land around railways. If it's a 5-minute walk to a railway, or 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, let's get healthy. The density around transport hubs will increase, needs to increase, if we're to maintain sort of social cohesion, because the divine right of housing is a concept that I think will be challenged over the next 10 years. It will be questioned.
So housing affordability will be on the cards for at least another 10 years of conversations going forward.
I'm sure it is. One of the things that I'm coming to have to build into my budgets is intergenerational transfer of wealth. If you were a baby boomer and you have done okay and you paid your house off, its value has gone up. And you might be thinking of downsizing, but the gains from that may go to your children rather than to you. It's like inheritance before you die. Is just going to be one way to go forward. I'm sure banks and even mortgage brokers are seeing more family interaction with new loans. You don't just talk to the parents, because the parents will be chipping in to assist the kids with a deposit and so on. And also the notion of, well, I can't afford to buy a house, but I might be able to afford an investment property and then rent or stay with mum and dad for a bit longer whilst I get into the housing market. And I'm sure a fair amount of that has gone on recently.
Absolutely.
And it makes sense. It makes sense. You can buy a property, but you're not going to live in it for another 5 years.
Exactly. Well, look, I personally was investing in properties whilst I was renting. So I think there might be an opportunity for, those Gen Ys, Gen Xs that think that they're outside of the scope of having home ownership could potentially still capitalise on the residential property wealth machine that Australia has generically had, and rent where they want to live and invest somewhere where they can afford. Indeed.
Well,
I have to say, Hans, thank you so much for putting everything so concisely and into a quick review for us, because I know that there's a lot of people out there dooming and glooming the economy and poo-hooing what's happening in the world, and sometimes having a bright spark of a clear summary of where we really are and what the opportunities are ahead has been really enlightening. So thank you so much for spending some time with us.
My pleasure, Jane.
ELIZA Owen recently did a very interesting TED Talk on home affordability. So as someone experiencing this crisis herself and as a recognised market analyst and economist at Residex, ELIZA is here today to add her perspective to this very important discussion. Hi, ELIZA.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think you're probably, 12 months ahead of everyone else bringing up the affordability crisis. It's something that's been going on for a while, hey?
That's right, yes. I think the most recent housing boom starting from 2013 was where we really saw the unaffordability situation escalate, particularly on the eastern seaboard.
Yeah, and so I guess one of the things I really enjoyed about your talk was the fact that you looked at past booms, because from a percentage-wise, we've actually had a bigger boom, haven't we, in the last 20 years?
Absolutely. So between 1987 and 1988, for the Greater Sydney metropolitan region, the median house experienced a peak growth rate of 38% over a 12-month period. And percentage-wise, that's the largest housing boom that we've seen in the last 30 years. And then I sort of argue in the TED Talk that between 2014 and 2015, at a peak growth rate of 20% over a 12-month period, that was the largest in terms of real dollar values.
So back in 1987, like the median house prices, I think you were saying about 121,000. It went up to 167, but in the last year we went from like 750 to 900, and now in Sydney, and this is just for Sydney, but now it's over 1 million.
Exactly. So at the time of doing the talk, the median was around 945,000. Now it's 1,042,000. That's the median value we have from our March data, which we're sort of currently revising at the moment. So that'll be out on the Residex blog very soon.
It's incredible, this housing affordability question. It feels like it's something new. People looking around, especially those in the capital cities where we've got median prices well over 500,000, saying my kids can never afford to buy a home. But it's kind of something that we've been facing ongoing for years. But it seems to be in terms of income, it's got worse. Is that why we're really hearing more about this crisis now?
I think that's part of it. I think the economy has sort of changed very much in terms of how it operates, in terms of the amount of jobs that it can provide. So what we're seeing is not only extreme growth in the housing market, but very stagnant wages and not a lot of growth in employment opportunities and vacancies. So that makes it very difficult. And again, like in real dollar terms, the housing boom from 2013 onward really has been a sort of unprecedented level of growth.
You're an economist just starting out, probably in this demographic. Is it something that worries you, ELIZA?
Look, to an extent, I'm quite comfortable renting at the moment. And I think that in a lot of ways, the standard of living has really improved for young people over the last few decades. I think there are ways that I might go about accumulating assets in the future. Whether that actually means owning and sort of living in my own property in Sydney, I'm not really sure. It does worry me a little bit. Worst came to worst for me, I'm lucky in that my parents do own their home and they've always sort of got a bed for me if I need it. So there is a bit of a safety net there for me.
They might charge you because they've probably rented your room out for Airbnb, but...
Oh, look, they probably would, yeah.
So tell me this. I mean, the younger demographic are not sitting around over there, whatever the latest cocktail is at the moment. I was told that it was an espresso cocktails going around. But
espresso martini?
Yes, espresso martini. There you go, showing my age. Yeah. And worrying about the fact they won't have a home. It's more of the parents worrying for the kids on the kids' behalf, is it?
Oh, look, no, I do think it's a bit of both. I think there are a lot of young people who worry about affordability. There are people in the capital cities who live more precariously, and I imagine it would be a more stressful situation for them if they didn't have that safety net and they want to sort of live near where they work and things like that.
Well, I have to say I had a quick conversation with my 8-year-old son this morning about doing his spelling test and studying for it, and he told me it wasn't going to be a problem because even if he failed, he could live at home forever. So we had to tell him the truth of the matter is that he probably wouldn't be welcome back after he's 18. Mind you, that's 10 years away.
There's an expiry date on it, isn't there?
There is an expiry date.
Like, I guess the other thing is baby boomers are coming up to retirement as well, and they've got to start thinking about their future. And perhaps that's where some of the worry comes from the older generations, is that they need to start looking out for themselves, and they want to know that their children can sort of stand on their own 2 feet, and obviously not at 8. But
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think the recent survey that came out, 2/3 were worried about their children affording a home, but they were also worried about their standard of living in the next 10 years. So I might have a solution to this. I'm interested in your thoughts. I know that you suggested that people might want to get a second job, or even, like you just said, get something from their parents, some help maybe living there, or some assistance. But I know when I bought my first investment property, we rented for 10 years while we accumulated our investment properties. The question that I'm consistently is going around my mind is that, a lot of people I speak to about the housing affordability crisis are saying, oh, that's it. Houses are off the agenda for me. But I think just thinking a little laterally around this, and you kind of alluded to it about your own wealth creation potential in the future, is you don't necessarily have to own the property you live in. And I know that it gave us a lot of flexibility. We can live in properties that were costing people, $1,000 a week in mortgages, and we were paying $350, $400 a week in rent. So we were living in really great areas, and with that, the money that we were saving to buy investment properties. So, I think that the conversation could almost be changed around to, it's not about first home purchasing, it's about first property purchasing, and giving people some direction on how that could, help them get into residential property and have the best of both worlds. What do you think?
I think there's a lot to that. Because of the affordability situation, it's almost become a necessity. I've spoken to a lot of young people in my sort of researching and writing who are in their 20s even and do own a property, but the only way they're able to afford that property is to rent it out. That, or they might have to sacrifice tertiary education for a little while, or they might have to pick up a few jobs. So it's this sort of phenomenon that's come about, and I think it is picking up in popularity, this term rent vesters, where you have people who are buying where they can afford and renting where they want to live. And I think that's a very reasonable way to accumulate wealth and get started on the property ladder, because people are then able to rent and live closer to where they work and things like that. I think perhaps the only thing you have to be careful with is, I don't know, it's hard, because for an individual I think it seems like a reasonable strategy. But in terms of, it might become a larger systematic problem if you have wealthy people who are investing in investment properties, and then that sort of pushes up the price of properties elsewhere. So an example of this is where Sydney investors have been spilling over into Melbourne and Brisbane to attain what is affordable for them. But then because you have fewer jobs and lower household incomes in Brisbane, say, it becomes less affordable for locals. So while I do think it's a good strategy to get on the property ladder, I think there are also some systematic issues where we need to allow for that, but we also need to simultaneously look at affordable housing options for those who really don't have a safety net in those other areas where investment is picking up.
Oh, so and it's a complex situation. I think we've probably just touched on the fact that there's a couple of answers out there, but there's long-term implications of the housing affordability issues, and I guess I guess it's going to be on the agenda for years to come. Well, ELIZA OWEN from Residex, thank you so very much for giving your personal perspective on the housing affordability crisis. I know that it's something that's a hot topic at the moment, and we're hearing from a lot of our community that it's a worry for them as well. So I really appreciate you adding your thoughts into this discussion.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, ELIZA. We are getting into some very interesting issues, and I'm sure our listeners have some questions or comments. John, let's open up the lines and see what our listeners think about all this or other questions they might have.
Sure, Jane. I'll just go over here. So we have Lou with her hand up. I'll just unmute Lou on the line. Lou, are you there?
Hello, Lou. How are you?
Hi, Jane. Great. So here you want to talk to someone about some rent investing?
Yes. Is that something you've done?
Yeah, I've been doing it now for about 15 years.
Wow. So tell me about it. What was the decision? How did you decide that that's what you're going to do and, relinquish the family home?
Look, the first one was the very first property I bought when I was in my early 20s. It was a 2-bedroom unit on the Central Coast. And I was living in that and living on 2-minute noodles, trying to scrape by with trying to pay the mortgage on my own with a pretty average wage at the time. And I had a friend who was a property investor who sat me down one day and said, why don't you move into another place instead and actually get the tax advantages? And we looked at how much tax I could get back because it was a new unit. And yeah, I'd never thought about this before. And funnily enough, the unit right next door to mine, which was a mirror reverse of the one that I was actually living in, came up for rent.
Yep.
So I moved into that, rented mine out for exactly the same amount, but ended up with about $50 to $70 a week extra in my hand in tax advantage. And it meant I could eat more than 2-minute noodles a week. So.
You moved on to mince, did you?
Exactly, I moved to mince. So.
And did you actually manage the property yourself or did you get an agent in?
No, I got an agent in. I didn't know what I was doing. And actually I was so impressed with the agent who was leasing me the one next door that I was going to move into that I said, do you want to lease mine out? So
interesting.
She looked a bit strangely at me to what I was doing, but it was great because I got to see her from the perspective of being the renter under her as well, and I was just really impressed. So, and she now looks after 4 of our properties. So
that's amazing, isn't it? I definitely recommend people when they're looking to buy a property to also go and see properties that are for rent on the market to check out the competition. But the other thing is to check out the rental agent. Is it just someone in the office who's not really interested on Facebook and just opening a home for 15 minutes, or someone who's going to talk about features and benefits? And I mean, that's even a better example of how to try before you buy with your rental agent. Now, tell me this: how did your family react when you said we're not going to buy our own home and virtually giving up the Australian dream of home ownership? Was there a kind of a shock, gasp?
No, to be honest, at that stage it was fine because I'd already lived, this was my own home, this tiny little 2-bedroom unit. So my parents had been there to hold my hand through the process of buying it and moving out of the family nest into it, and they did see how I was struggling financially in paying the bills. But yeah, it's a bit of a rite of passage. I think they saw as well. They did see it as quite risky, me moving out, because there is that doom and gloom, especially my mother, who's very risk averse. Of what if you get a tenant that's going to trash the place? And, it's all right, Mum, I've got insurance.
Yeah.
And, what if it's vacant? Well, that's all right, I'll move back into it. So there was a lot of those what ifs, but I think they were eased into it because I'd already lived into it for 6 months. So I still had that there, and there was always that notion of, well, I'll move back into it one day. And I guess essentially that was the whole idea of I'll just move next door and rent until I can then afford the mortgage and I'll move back into it. Of course, that never happened. So.
And you brought your family along with you when you upgraded houses. I imagine they preferred the upgraded house than what you could possibly afford on a mortgage.
Yeah, look, I mean, since I was single at the time with that one, and then since met my husband and we moved into a place together because we were a new relationship, we decided to rent to start with and moved into the place we're in now. We've been here for over 10 years.
And over that time you built up a large portfolio.
Yeah, look, the place we're renting, it's this beautiful beach house on the Central Coast, overlooks the beach. There's no way we could afford to buy this ourselves. The rent's probably a third of what the mortgage would be. We are seen as the renter scum in the street, but they still let us drive in.
It's amazing, isn't it, the difference in price between the rent and the mortgage?
It's funny. I think we had a bit of an aha moment when we were sitting on a balcony watching our new neighbours move in that had bought a house similar to ours, and they spent about $1.5 million buying it. And we knew that they weren't investors, and we thought, wow, we're getting all this rent coming in each week, and we still get to live here, and we've got so much more than these poor neighbours next door. You've got the same view as us, the same lifestyle, but we just have so much more just by only doing things differently and having a much better result. So.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's great. And I think that more and more as we go through and this kind of affordability issue, which is not going to stop, let's face it, younger people, I think they're a little bit more flexible as well in considering this alternative. And, let's face it, with all of the units in Sydney and Melbourne and all the other states that are coming on board, picking up some cheap rent close to the city and close to the lifestyle it should be really easy going forward in the next few years.
Especially with them just being so transient with jobs these days and careers. I mean, why would you want to shackle yourself to one particular house? It's perfect just to rent, but you can still keep your foot in the property market just elsewhere through investments.
Exactly. Well, I used to have friends come and stay with us and come visit, and we were at one stage we were staying in this luxury kind of Meriton apartment block, and we had the pool downstairs and the barbecue area, and they were like, "Oh wow, you're living the dream." And we're like, "Yeah, we are."
We love doing that. It's like, we're just renters.
Oh, well, look, that is such a great story. The fact that you moved from 2-minute noodles onto an extra $70 in your pocket from your first property, and then living on a beach house. So you're kind of living everyone's dream now.
Yeah, look, I think it frustrates me when I hear the story of a lot of people saying, just can't get my foot in the market. And I just think, just stop thinking of the traditional way. There are so many other ways to do it, and it's still an easy process. It's just a different process you've got to take these days.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it, Lou.
No worries, Jane. Thank you.
Jane, I have Hayley on the line here. Apparently she sent you an email last week in response to a video that you posted, and you said you would like to speak to her. So I'll just unmute Hayley's line here. Hey,
Hayley, how are you going?
Well, I just wanted to thank you for the information that you've been actually giving out for free, and wanted to tell you how much it's helped me.
Yeah.
I'm got a little 2-bedroom unit up in Cairns that had tenants in for 4 years, and they left it in fairly good state. But I mean, it'd been 13 years since it's been refurbed, and so I'm sort of a bit on a tight budget, and I utilise the information that you've been providing in the webinars that I've been listening to over the last 2 years, and use that to help make a decision on how to spend my very limited budget to get the refurb done and get it in tip-top shape to re-rent it, because I was facing, if I couldn't get rental tenants back in there and at a good price, then I'd be losing the property through mortgagee sale, not being able to pay the mortgage.
Oh my gosh, Hayley, I got to tell you, you're giving me goosebumps. I'm sitting here with goosebumps. I am so happy to hear that. And you were able to obviously, get a bang for your buck and put every dollar and make it count, but you got to push the rent up as well?
Yes, I did. I'm just in the final stages of securing tenants at the moment, but we've had offers at $50 above what it was tenanted at before.
When potential tenants are putting in offers, you're in a good place, don't you?
Yes, yeah, it's a real relief to the mind. It's going to be a relief to the banks too.
Oh well, I got to say, suffering that kind of hardship is obviously something that's very stressful, and when we're talking here about the affordability crisis, not just getting into a situation where you can't continue to afford a mortgage, but a lot of people don't see they'll ever get a mortgage themselves in the future. So, that kind of financial pressure in your life is something that you don't want. And, hopefully we can come up with some solutions to help solve that. But it sounds like you're also a rent investor yourself. Is that right? You're a rent investor yourself?
Yes, yeah. Well, I bought the property originally about in 2003 with the idea of living in it, but it's been rented out for since 2007, because at that stage I was working in a remote island. But about 18 months ago I got made unemployed, and so since then I've actually been living in a van, travelling around Australia trying to re-establish myself. So I'm sort of in a unique position that I'm a property owner that can't afford to live in my own property, nor can I afford to rent a property. So
gosh,
definitely this affordability is definitely a key issue with me at the moment.
You're really at the extreme, aren't you, of the, we're talking about people renting where they want to live, which is going to be cheaper than having a mortgage where they want to live. But you're in a van travelling around Australia with no mortgage at all or no rent.
Yep. Yep. No, I'm one of what I like to term these sort of the modern homeless, and there's surprisingly there's quite a lot of others out that I've met out there on the roads, or staying in caravan parks, living in mobile homes or tents that are in similar circumstances. In fact, in a lot of cases, a lot worse off circumstances than myself.
Gosh, it just it makes you realise I'm very grateful, when you look at your own situation compared to others, because there's always someone in a worse situation, isn't there?
Yeah.
Well, look, Hayley, I really appreciate you sharing your story because, you're obviously living with the affordability issues yourself, but you've been able to turn around your current investment property and rent it out at a profit, and obviously not go into mortgagee sale situation, which is obviously a black mark against your name. So being able to get rid of that pressure is fabulous, and I'm so glad that the webinars have really helped you in doing that.
Well, like I say, I'm really appreciative of the information you're giving out. Certainly the context, like Jacob from Ripe House, that his offer that you put out recently came at perfect timing for me to figure out, well, do I flip the unit off as is or do I keep it? And it really, his information that he was giving out really helped me to work out, well, if I flip it now in the current market, I'm actually going to lose out. So it was worth it to fight to put the money together to do the refurb.
I'm so glad that you did, and that location is so key, finding the right location to start with. So I'm glad that the tools and resources that we've given you have allowed you to assess that you could keep this property rather than, taking a hit and probably having to come up with the difference of the value and the loan that you might have been up for. I hope that, other people listen to the webinars and get as much out of them that you have and been able to, turn a potentially terrible situation around. So thank you again for calling in.
Yep, thank you.
Wow, what a story, hey?
I know, really touching. It's amazing sometimes when you realise how many people you can really affect with something as simple as a little webinar or a bit of information or email, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You put it out there, but you don't quite know where it lands, do you?
That's a good way of putting it, John. Look, in light of the conversation we've been having about the housing affordability crisis, we've looked at the economy and what this might mean for the future, but I think this discussion should be put in context of the big picture. Now, it's important to note that the residential housing market is worth $6.5 trillion. Now, as a comparison, the entire value of the Australian listed stock exchange is $1.5 trillion. There's no doubt that residential property has been the foundation of wealth for most Australians historically and in the future. RP Data has just published one of my favourite reports, their quarterly pain and gain report that analyses property resales of established properties. Now, to gain further insight about this report and much more, I've invited Cameron KUSHER from CoreLogic's RP Data, he's the Senior Research Analyst, to come along and share his knowledge about this. Welcome, Cameron, and thank you for fitting us into your very busy schedule.
Thanks for having me, Jane.
Well, look, let's just start straight with that pain and gain report. I have to say, I look forward to it every quarter. So when it came out just recently, I consumed it greatly. Now, can you just tell me what has been the changes that you've seen over the last quarter and indeed over the last year from this report?
Sure. So in the end of last year, so at the end of 2015, over that final quarter, we saw that 8.4% of properties across the nation sold at a loss compared to what they were purchased for. Now, the analysis doesn't take into consideration holding costs, stamp duty costs, and other interest costs, for example, that people incur while they're holding that property. It just simply looks at whether it's sold for more or less than the previous purchase price. Mm-hmm. Now, that figure was up slightly from 8.3% at the end of the September 2015 quarter and steady over the year. But the big difference we found was between the capital cities and the regional markets. So across the combined capital cities, 5.7% of properties resold at a loss compared to 13.4% in the regional market. So it also shows you a big discrepancy between the housing market performances in capital cities and in regional markets.
No, that's really interesting. I guess the thing is that it's the location of where you buy is so very important, and that's what this report has fundamentally indicated as well, hasn't it?
It really has. So we know that the Sydney and Melbourne housing markets have been seeing some pretty strong capital gains over recent years, and if you look at those areas, so only 1.9% of properties in Sydney resold at a loss over the quarter, down from 2.3% a year earlier. In Melbourne, only 4.2% of properties resold at a loss, compared to 5.4% a year earlier. We're seeing the figures trend lower also in Brisbane, down from 10% a year ago to 7.9% now. But we look to some of the weaker housing markets, and we know that at the moment values are falling in Perth and Darwin. Perth has actually seen 13.8% of properties resold at a loss over the quarter, up from 5.4% a year ago.
Wow.
And in Darwin, we've seen the figure move from 10.2% of properties 12 months ago to 13.5% over the final quarter of last year.
So just talking about those markets, is there some upside that you see for those markets going forward in 2016?
I think there will be. Obviously, we know at the moment the rate of growth in Sydney and Melbourne seems to be slowing, but we're still seeing growth, and I guess that's the point. So I think you might actually see those proportion of loss-making resales trend a little bit lower, probably more so in Melbourne than Sydney. I don't know how much lower it can actually go in Sydney.
Yeah.
In markets like Brisbane and Hobart and even Canberra, we know that housing market conditions in those cities are improving. So you'll probably start to see those that percentage of loss-making resales also trend lower rather in the next 12 months.
And I guess, if we kind of put a positive spin on this, 8.4% of resales have transacted at a loss, but that's 91.6% of them made a profit, right?
That's exactly right. And if you actually put some numbers to that, there was $17.1 billion worth of realised profit at an average of just over $270,000 per resold property at a profit. So people are generally doing very well out of residential property, and this really highlights that fact.
It's amazing when we, I guess, put this in the light of the conversation we're having here around housing affordability, and we look at this report as a historical stamp of where we've come from. If, most people are making $270,000 of wealth, accumulated wealth for themselves through property, it really shows you that residential property has been the foundation for most people in creating that wealth going forward in the future, hasn't it?
It certainly has, and I guess the other point there is you don't necessarily have to sell your property to realise that profit. Obviously, particularly, again, in Sydney and Melbourne, we've seen some really strong capital growth over recent years. People have got a lot of equity sitting in their properties, and we've seen that they're using that to go and buy investment properties, go and buy lifestyle properties because of that wealth creation from the higher property prices.
And I guess that's an interesting point, although those areas have had that growth, maybe they can't afford to buy in Sydney and Melbourne, but that's what's driving those Brisbane, Hobart and even Canberra markets you mentioned earlier. It
certainly is, and what we're starting to see in some of these other areas is migration starting to turn. So it does look like, probably more so Sydney than Melbourne, but people are getting priced out of those markets and looking to these areas because, firstly, the economies are generally improving. We're getting some more job creation in markets like southeast Queensland and in Hobart and even Canberra. So that means that people can move to these regions and actually get a job and get paid and pay off that mortgage. But also there's obviously now a big difference in the cost of housing between these areas, which have really not seen much in the way of capital growth in the last 7 or 8 years, to Sydney and Melbourne, where you've seen fairly consistent capital growth over that period.
So I guess there's two outcomes here. One is you could potentially keep your property in the Sydney and Melbourne market and make it an investment property and move to a cheaper area, or you could actually invest somewhere that's cheaper whilst you continue to enjoy the fruits of that market going up in the future, the Sydney and Melbourne market. So I guess it's a great story of giving opportunity of where you can actually use this kind of market changes that we're seeing.
Exactly right. So just people need to read into this and understand that I guess it's not one market nationally. It's not even a capital city market. You find within these capital cities that certain areas and certain property types are performing much better than others. And it's really doing that high level of research and understanding, where you sit, how much equity you've got, where you can afford to buy, what sort of property you should be buying, but there's always opportunities out there.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I know that location is the absolute key to this, and you've mentioned, the losses in capital cities being 5.7% and regional areas are 13.4%. Of those regional areas, with people facing these affordability issues and potentially can't borrow as much as they used to be able to, what are the resales that you're seeing in the regional areas and I guess the areas that are doing well, and what kind of industries do they have in common?
Yeah, I guess if we have a look at the regional markets, again, regional New South Wales is doing quite well. And the areas where we're seeing quite improving and relatively strong housing market conditions are not surprisingly Wollongong and Newcastle in New South Wales. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that is people are getting priced out of Sydney and moving to these areas because you can still commute to Sydney if you need to, and obviously that cost of housing is a lot more affordable. In regional Victoria, still a relatively low level of loss-making sales, but they're rising a little bit. But again, markets like Geelong, for example, the Latrobe Valley, we're seeing some strength in those markets. And then in Queensland, it's a lot of the lifestyle markets where we're actually starting to see some strength coming back in. And obviously, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast are in the southeast corner of Queensland. We're seeing some strength in those markets, but also areas like Cairns and the Wide Bay region in Queensland. So it does suggest that maybe some of that lifestyle property buying in Queensland is coming back into the market.
Have you got any numbers or feeling around houses versus units in your figures?
In the capital cities, loss-making sales for houses were 4.7% compared to 7.9% for units. And in the regional markets, the split was 11.3% for houses, 20% for units. So, and across most of the markets, you're finding that the units have a higher proportion of loss-making resales than houses. And I think that kind of feeds into the fact that even though we're building a lot more units in a lot of areas and people are more willing to live in higher density inner city areas, I think ultimately most Australians still aspire to own a house with a block of land that they can call their own and don't have to share with anyone else.
And I guess with the reported oversupply of units that we're seeing in a lot of those capital city developments that are coming online in the next few years, we might see those numbers increase for units in the capital cities as well.
I definitely think so. And if you have a look at Melbourne, for example, a lot of talk about an oversupply of inner city units in Melbourne. So only 2.5% of houses resold at a loss over the last quarter, compared to 8% for units. And it was a similar story in Brisbane. 5.3% of houses resold at a loss compared to 15.6% units. So I think that does highlight that, particularly at the moment with such a high level of new unit supply, there is a bit of a risk, and some people are finding it hard to resell for more than what they purchased those properties for.
Well, look, let's just go to where we are right now in the market. We've had a really good look at where we've come from. The April 2016 chart pack is just out, and once again, one of my reports I look forward to each month in reviewing. I guess there's, what we've seen is that we've been through a bit of a period where there's been some slowdown, but it looks like home values are up again after a fall. What do you think's driving this?
Well, what we saw late last year was, I guess, a fall in sentiment for the housing market. And over the final quarter of last year, we saw values fall. So far this year, we've seen values rise by a bit more than 1.5% over the first quarter of this year. But if we actually look at the longer-term trend, so the 12-month change, the rate of growth, values are still increasing. It's a very important point to make, but they're increasing at a slower pace. So values over the last 12 months have increased by 6.4%, which is their slowest annual rate of growth since September 2013. But they're still rising. And the reason why the national figures are showing a decline in values is largely due to Sydney. So in June of last year, Sydney home values were increasing at an annual rate of 18.5%. They've now fallen, or slowed rather, to an annual rate of growth of just 7.4%. And obviously Sydney being the largest capital city, the most sales, has a fairly big influence on this index.
And I guess the thing is, if we put that in the bigger, broader picture, the old rule of 72, if you've got a 7% growth, you're still doubling your value of your property in 10 years, which kind of corresponds with your own occupied numbers that you've seen in the pain and gain report.
That's right. So I think nobody would argue that a 7% capital growth is still very strong. It's certainly nowhere near what the Sydney market was doing over the last 24, 36 months, but it's still a strong level of capital gain. Only Melbourne's actually recording capital gains stronger than Sydney at the moment.
So it's great to, I guess, when we read the papers and we see the rate of growth is dropping significantly, it doesn't mean that the property values are dropping. It just means that it's slowing down and probably getting back to the new norm.
Well, our forecast for this year is that values will still rise, but the rate of growth is going to be slow. We think by the end of 2016, values will be up somewhere around 3%.
Yep.
We think that there's a bit of a switch going on. So, as I said, Sydney, and along with Melbourne, has the biggest influence on our figures because they are the two largest markets. Our forecast is that by the end of the year, Sydney will probably be seeing annual value growth of around 2%. Melbourne's is going to slow to around 7%. But while those two markets are going to slow in terms of their rate of capital growth, we think that markets like Brisbane, Hobart and Canberra are actually going to accelerate.
Now, we don't want to leave Adelaide, Perth and Darwin out of the picture for 2016. Have you got some thoughts of what your projections are for those capital cities?
So in terms of Adelaide, we've seen values rise by about 3% over the last year. And really for the last 6 or 7 years, there hasn't been much change in the Adelaide market. It's a slow and steady performer. We think that's going to continue again this year. We think that values will rise about 3% again through 2016. In terms of Perth and Darwin, both of those markets are seeing values fall. But interestingly, that rate of decline has started to slow over the last couple of months. And our view is that Perth and Darwin will see values fall by the end of this year, probably around the 1% mark, and then slowly starting to improve through 2017 and 2018. But it's going to be a very slow return to growth in those markets, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, we talked about the switch, and we've seen this, as you mentioned, the switch from the investor space and the frenzy that was around in 2014 and 15, and the APRA and ASIC changes have obviously made a lot of reductions in that investor mortgage market. And I imagine that although we're indicating that RBA is potentially not going to put their rates up going forward, the banks possibly will due to the cost of funds going forward. Do you see this switch continuing going over the next year or 2 years where we do see the investors pull back and it becomes even more important where they do invest and the location of that than the owner-occupied market?
We'll probably see investment lending. I think it's fallen as much as it's going to fall. I think we'll see a pretty steady flat trend over the next 12 to 18 months. But again, I think people will actually change where they're investing. So it's not going to be about Sydney and Melbourne anymore. Investors will start looking at other capital cities and maybe starting to focus more on capital growth potential along with the rental return rather than just the investment we've seen a lot of lately, which has just been about that capital growth at a time when rental yields in Sydney and Melbourne have been pretty much at record lows. The owner-occupied segment, I think obviously people will still be looking to upgrade into bigger, better properties in better locations. Refinancing will be a big part of the market as well because obviously, again, in Sydney and Melbourne, people have got an awful lot of equity sitting in their properties. But I think in terms of the investment side of things, I think people will start to look outside of Sydney and Melbourne for opportunities in other capital cities.
Cameron, thank you so much. I guess pulling this all together from the Pain and Gain report and the chart pack, the interesting things that I've taken away from this is there's a lot of equity that people have that they can access, but they're going to have to be very, very diligent about where they buy and what they buy in the future, and it's not necessarily going to be in their own backyard. So, look, I really appreciate you spending the time with us today and putting everything in context for us in the light of this whole question about the housing affordability crisis and where to from here.
Thanks very much for having me, Jane.
Thank you, Cameron.
Well, some very valuable information there, Jane. We've had some great input this evening.
I agree, and some interesting comments and texts coming from our listeners as well. Why don't we take a few more calls? Who has their hand up?
Well, let's see. We have quite a few here. How about Sandra? Let me unmute her line.
Hello, Sandra. How are you?
Hi, Jane. I'm well, thank you.
Now, you have a bit of a story, do you?
I do.
Do tell.
Okay, well, I have actually been living overseas for a number of years, and I actually have two properties. I have my principal property and then an investment property. Mm-hmm. And they have both been rented out while I've been living in Mexico.
Wow.
But with your principal property, you need to live in it every so often. Mm. At last check, it was about 6 years. Mm-hmm. So that may or may not change from time to time. So I've come back to live in the property because if you don't live in the property every 6 years, you incur capital gains tax if you sell it. So I've come back to live here, and, it's a bit tired having been rented for a number of years. So I'm sort of fixing it up, getting it a bit of a cosmetic do, so to speak, and thinking about selling and buying in a better area with regard to capital gains.
And is your investment property in the same area that your home's in?
It is. It's just down the road.
Oh, you're one of the round-the-corner investors.
Well, yeah, the reason I did that at the time was I thought, same real estate agent can manage it. I'm over the ocean, and at the time, the yield was quite good, the rental yield. So hence I decided to stay in the area when I was looking.
I have to say I've spoken to a lot of people who have, due to convenience, bought around the corner for renovating or the fact that they could keep an eye on it, but I've never heard of anyone buying around the corner so they could use the same rental manager.
Yeah, I got a discount.
Good, excellent. Good work. Well, look, how has the area performed? I mean, capital growth obviously seems to be a bit of an issue.
Dreadful in the last 7 years or 8 years. I actually came back last year and lived in Brisbane for a while and lived there 8 years ago when I was here for 12 months. So, quite interested in Brisbane as, good investment. And but what's really interesting is that this area has picked up in the last 2 months. I've had real estate agents knocking on the door saying, are you interested in selling? Mm-hmm. And they say it's picked up, 6 or 7% growth-wise. And I was actually on Ripe House webinar with Jacob, and he's highlighted Tweed Heads, which is the next suburb, as an emerging suburb this month. That's interesting.
So whereabouts are you?
Benora Point. It's northern New South Wales, just
over the border.
A few kilometres from the border, yeah.
Gosh, a few kilometres from the border in Mexico and a few kilometres from the border in New South Wales. So I guess we're talking here about housing affordability crisis and the rent to invest. You've taken that literally and you've rented overseas in Mexico whilst you've had your investment properties.
Yes.
So quite an extreme example. And was that work related, or was the fact that you had a better lifestyle over there? Could you live somewhere nicer, or was it just the fact it was an opportunity that you could pursue and keep your investment properties?
It's probably lifestyle. I prefer the lifestyle elsewhere. But like everybody else in Australia, everyone's in this whole retirement panic, and I need the money, and having been overseas for many years, I don't have super here. From that point of view, I think it's better to keep property in Australia.
Well, and I think your question really was, obviously you shared your experience about how your rent to investing, but should I sell with the light of there could be better capital gains elsewhere? And I've just pulled up the Residex predicted growth report for Benora Point. And so I can see what you're saying here is that there hasn't been a lot of change, but, over the last few years, 2013, 2014, there was 5%, which is decent, 14, 15, 6%. But there has been a lot of growth. But the great thing about this is that there is predicted growth over the next few years that is on the cards. And there's a lot of drivers for that area. Obviously, the Gold Coast has a big focus on it with the upcoming Commonwealth Games and development, etc. But also, tourism and internal tourism. When, the Australian dollar, it's too expensive for us to go overseas. Everyone looks to somewhere else to go within Australia, so we get the same value for money. So there's a lot of those drivers going on. And what the Residex reports indicates, in the next 5 years, there'll be growth of 7% per annum, and next 8 years, 6% per annum. So if we apply that rule of 72 divided by 7, that means that your property, based on a 7% growth year on year, over 10 years will double in value. So this is real indication of a holding kind of strategy, and maybe by the virtue of the convenience of having a property around the corner with the same agent, you've got two properties going up in value and that's a sensational growth prediction, especially in the light of the fact that we're in the market changes at the moment where we're seeing the Sydney market and Melbourne market coming off, and the Brisbane market really starting to get a little bit of movement. But that flow-on effect and those dynamics that I pointed out in the Gold Coast, this would seem to be a bit of a keeper to me.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Well, make sure you don't spend too much on that renovation.
No, I shan't. I won't.
Thanks so much for your time, Sandra. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jane.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Jane, we also have another question from one of our audience members, Damien. He is also asking about how to choose the right location.
Hi, Damien. Are you there?
I am. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. You have a question?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to know if I'm buying in a certain area, what, I guess, guarantees I would be getting in that area to, in making sure that I do get a return on the property.
So give me a little bit of background. You've invested before?
I did a few years back now, but I invested and sold the property. It was a rental property in Carrum Downs.
Okay. And were you happy with that investment?
It really didn't move, but then again, I shouldn't have been looking at a short-term option. I should have been looking a little longer in that area. Okay. And you've got your own home now, or you're renting? Renting. Yeah. Perfect. So very, very poignant for the conversation that we're having at the moment about maybe rent to invest, which is something that I did for the last 10 years. So, it's something that I know works. And I guess the real crux of your question is, if you're going to do this, how do you know where to buy and make sure that you have the fundamentals right so that, it is creating wealth for you as well as, helping you out with the cash flow as well? Yeah, that's right, because I think really, I guess the advice I got was I didn't get really much advice anyway. It was sort of a friend of a friend who said, yeah, why not Carrum Downs? And back then, I really didn't have the knowledge or expertise to sort of be able to say, oh, yeah, well, that's a growing area and that's going to do well. And, so my question is to you guys basically is, is there some sort of, do you look at certain areas and say, okay, this is the amount of money you have at this stage, that this is what you can be investing in and what areas you should be investing in? Yeah. Look, it's a great question because I think a lot of people that I speak to have been a little bit lost in their past investment decisions and probably a little bit disappointed about where they have bought. And I think the best, I had heard someone said that the taxi driver told him it was a good idea, so he ended up investing in an area. So a friend of a friend's not that bad, Damien, to be honest. But no, that's exactly right, because you often find that some of the advice you're getting, you're not actually, you're getting it from either a friend or a family member and they're not necessarily, the experts in that. Exactly. Well, look, the good news is, I'm not going to say there's a magic pill, but there is a formula and a foundation that I definitely use when assessing a location. And, I have a whole step-by-step methodology on how to do this. But that anticipation, and you didn't infer to the fact that, you felt that there was a population demand in Carrum Downs, that is one of the drivers of capital growth. And, if you're familiar with my Trident strategy, I try to have 3 ways of making money in a property. Just in case I get one wrong, I've got, 2 to fall back on. And those are, knowing an area well enough and doing the research to
be able to buy below the market, so creating instant equity. The second is having the ability to renovate and add equity in the meantime and push the rent up to keep the cash flow, the difference between the rent and the mortgage payments and the costs down. And then long term, having that growth to have that sustained kind of wealth accumulation. And we've just heard from Cameron from RP Data, and we looked at the pain and gain report, and their analysis on people that were losing money in the market when they resold a property was that, just as you said, they didn't hold the property for long enough. It is a long-term game plan. And, that's one component where the capital growth potential comes in. The population demand is really important, but there's some key fundamentals. I start with my whole dot map methodology, which is kind of looking at the ripple effect. So what has driven the market in the past? So I look at what the past 10-year growth has been for suburbs in a particular state. So I might take a capital city of Melbourne, which is obviously where you're investing, and I'll map out what the capital growth has been in the last 10 years. And what you can often see is some pressure points, the pricing pressure, where one area might become unaffordable. And so the need to the market kind of pulls over into the next suburb. So it kind of pulls up the price of the next suburb. And that ripple effect is something that's, I guess, at a high level, the first pass indicator that I'd look at. But then I try to get really deep into the fundamentals of what makes a successful suburb for my strategy. So if your strategy is that buy and hold, then you're targeting the rental market. So my minimum requirement for renters in an area is 30%. So I want to make sure that at least 30% of the market in a particular suburb are renters. And so that kind of gives me the confidence that when I go to rent my property, there's a market. But also, I want to make sure that there's not an overflow of stock there. And one of the indicators of that is vacancy rate. So there's a general consensus that if the vacancy rate is at 3%, then the market's in equilibrium. The same amount of people looking as is available to properties to rent. But for less than 3%, so if you read in the back of one of the magazine's data banks, it might say, that, for instance, Brunswick has a vacancy rate of 1.5%. That means that there's a lot more people looking than properties available. So that gives you an indication also, a bit of risk minimisation in the sense that what happens if I can't rent the property. If you had a rental vacancy of 4% or 5%, there's a lot more market available, a lot more properties on the market than there are people who are actually looking. So that would be the second thing that I'd look at just as an absolute precursor, because, as you've indicated, you rent where you want to live right now, but you've got money that you want to invest and create wealth. And, knowing where to buy is so very important. So some of the areas that Cameron threw up recently, included, say, Geelong, so maybe looking regionally. But I guess the big takeaway for me from what he was saying was capital cities had that sustained growth and the least likelihood to lose money on resale when you did want to sell the property. So, and even the flow-on effects of what we've seen in the growth in, for instance, Sydney. So the Wollongong and Newcastle market has moved up. The Brisbane is just starting to go through their growth cycle. And so there's a lot of activity around even the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. And obviously the median price up there is a lot lower than it is in Melbourne and Sydney. So you might actually get more for your money closer to the CBD and reduce that risk of not making money out of the property you invest in.
That makes a lot of sense. If I had have had that information before we purchased Curran Downs, I think I would have done a lot better.
Well,
it was interesting you talked about Geelong, because Geelong really is only 40 minutes away from Melbourne, and either to commute by car or train. It's only after you've said it sounds a perfect option.
Absolutely. And just looking at Geelong, I know that I've drilled down into that Geelong market. There's markets within Geelong as well, obviously different suburbs. And, I know one of my risk minimisation plans with my property portfolio is I want to have an on-tap kind of rental market that's not going anywhere fast. So all of my properties are next to universities and hospitals because I know they can't up and leave quick, right? So some of those areas in Geelong that might be close proximity to those type of infrastructure are going to probably have that greater than 30% renters. So you'd want to check the vacancies. Be close to public transport, because that's important. As you said, commutability to Melbourne now is not such a big deal. We've got a lot of people doing that in Geelong. And this is just as good advice to anyone looking in those flow-on effects to, Sydney, Brisbane, because we know that it's, it takes an hour and a half on a train between Newcastle and Wollongong to get to Sydney as well. So, there's, I think, just the freedom that you have as a renter who invests elsewhere means that you don't necessarily have to be constrained by your investing in your state. And often what that means is you can actually invest somewhere else where you get more money or more property for the money that you have.
No, perfect.
Well,
no, I think you've covered exactly what I was talking. My question was basically, how can I be guaranteed of getting a return? And I think what you mentioned before with the risk minimisation that you put in place, it ticks all the boxes and covers everything. I mean, if you had those answers for everyone, that is just, I can't think of anything that I would pick on in whatever you said. It's just, it's really, it makes sense.
And I think a lot of the times people have that hope strategy. If I buy here, I hope I get it right. But the reality is it's a step-by-step process and you can minimise your risk every step of the way. So you may not be guaranteed results, but geez, you come pretty close.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll have to come directly to you this time.
Well, David,
thank you.
We're going to be running a workshop, I think later next month in Melbourne on how to locate property. So it might be something, watch your email, it might be something you want to join us for.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your question, David.
No worries at all. Thank you.
It's interesting, isn't it, that, that's not the first time we've kind of heard someone say something like that. I don't know if you remember Derek, who comes to mind. He was one of the beta testers when we started the Ultimate Guide to Renovation, and he said, "Oh God, you've saved me from buying the wrong house."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's something I encounter frequently. It's probably the biggest mistake investors make. Incorrect assumptions when purchasing and then purchasing in the wrong location.
Yeah, people tend to get their property investment advice at barbecues from their brother-in-law, don't they?
Yeah, or from the taxi driver.
Yeah.
Look, we've had the benefit of getting advice from experts and first-hand accounts this evening, and I know out there are many people who are concerned that they will not be able to afford the Australian dream of owning their own home. And as we've heard, the market is still growing, and this will still continue in the future. Now, I've noticed a repeated pattern tonight, and I wonder if you did as well. This is something that I've been thinking about in depth recently. Maybe it is time to think of accomplishing your dreams by investing now and renting the house that you want to live in. Some people say you can't go wrong buying a property. Wrong, you can. You can do great harm to your financial future if you buy a home for the wrong reasons. This is especially true for people who either like to move frequently or have a job situation that forces them to do so. By moving often, you lose a substantial amount of money in transaction costs, both buying and selling. And as an investor, you can do tremendous harm to your financial situation by buying in the wrong location.
And Jane, on that important note about location, you did mention to Damien during your conversation that you had a hot spotting workshop coming up.
Yes, and I'm very much looking forward to it. We've those coming up in May and June for Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it too because I get to come on a road trip.
I know, it should be good.
Yes, it is. The last workshop in Melbourne in February was fantastic. They absolutely loved it, particularly the property inspection.
Yeah, that was fun going through the property, wasn't it? But more about that later. Let's recap because I want to highlight what I feel are some of the really important things that we covered here tonight because there were so many of them. So first, we started with Hans from St George Banking Group, who gave us an overview of the current market and shared with us his analysis that it's not all doom and gloom, but actually quite positive. What stood out for me was that he said the divine right of Australians to own a home may be coming to an end soon. And then there was ELIZA from Residex, and she gave us a younger person's point of view of how the affordability challenge is affecting her own experience. Now remember, she is renting a lovely home near the beach and investing separately for wealth creation, and this strategy is certainly paying off for her. And then Cameron from CoreLogic RP Data helped us to see where the growth and losses have been in recent months. The data he presented highlighted the fact that ownership of property, whether for investment or owner-occupier purposes, should be seen as a long-term investment. And of course, our audience provided some really interesting food for thought on affordability and on their feelings about renting and investing.
Jane, I have the dates here for the up-and-coming workshops.
Oh, great.
Sydney is on Saturday the 21st of May, Melbourne workshop is on Saturday the 28th of May, and the Brisbane suburb workshop is on Saturday the 18th of June.
Oh, it is going to be a road trip.
Yep, absolutely.
Look, if you're someone who's time poor or someone who's not 100% sure of the right steps in choosing a location to invest, you'll find these workshops really helpful.
Yeah, well, at least the good thing is you, at the end of the day, you walk away with a list of suburbs, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The whole day is spent identifying the highest performing suburbs at the moment, and then at the end of the process, you'll have a list of suburbs to take home with you. I should mention we also do a live property inspection, and people find this really valuable. And I also throw in some free access to paid property software tools like RP Data, Residex and Ripehouse. So those dates again, if you'd like to join me, is Sydney, Saturday the 21st of May, Melbourne, Saturday the 28th of May, and Brisbane, Saturday the 18th of June.
I've just posted the link for the 3 workshops into the chat box there. Could someone just message me and let me know that they've come through okay?
And look, you can always contact Diana at the office, support@yourpropertysuccess.com.au to find out more details. Now, it is important to say here, John, that these workshops are for just 12 people. So we're only going deep dive for just a small group of people. This is not a huge room where you don't get access to us and everything that we're doing, and you can ask us all the questions that you need.
Very close and personal.
Especially in those bus trips where we're trying to find the property to look at. So you will get direct access to us and we'll be able to answer all your questions.
And a few drinks afterwards as well.
Yeah, always fun.
Yep.
Especially on a road trip, right?
Yeah.
So look, just to recap, the workshops provide a structured process for identifying and selecting the next up-and-coming suburbs. We also do that real live property inspection. You get to walk through a property with us in one of these areas, so you really get that hands-on experience of what you should be looking for when you take all this information back home and apply it. So I think that pretty much covers everything tonight, John.
Yep.
It's been fabulous.
Absolutely. Really great webinar tonight.
Look, amazing people. This webinar, look, it will be available for replay tomorrow and available for 72 hours only. After that, it's exclusively accessed through the Your Property Success Club just for the members and the Investors Choice Gold and Diamond members in the resource section. And I'd also like to thank our really special guests tonight because they added so much value to this whole discussion about housing affordability and the crisis that we're in and potentially going to continue in the future. So to Hans, ELIZA and Cameron and all of those who posted questions, I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of you. For all of those that I did speak to, thank you for being so generous in sharing your stories. I plan on doing regular webinars on a lot of topics as they come up and as they affect us as property investors. So please keep an eye on your inbox for this next special event that I'm planning right now. But until then, stay safe, and here is to your property success.